In this episode, we cover foundational topics and dig into the basics of Python and the Flask web framework, how they work together and how we use Flask as a base for developer office hours episodes and also in our Stripe samples, which is a collection of GitHub repositories demonstrating integrations with many different Stripe products. So you might be just getting started and are curious about how to build a web application from scratch to take your first online payment. And so this episode will cover some basics to help you get started quickly with Python and Flask. So if you've already got a backend set up and you're comfortable with like adding new routes and are looking to add a new Stripe integration, you might want to check out some of the other office hours episodes we have where we show how to integrate specific Stripe products and features. So why Flask? Flask, in its own words, is a Python web framework built with a small core and easy to extend philosophy. So this allows us to keep the code for a demo concise while also still showing a real working example. So it might be helpful to watch and refer to a couple other videos before watching this episode. So number one is the episode about managing environment variables with Python, specifically the python.env package. And the second being the introduction to the Stripe CLI, which is a really powerful command line tool. So as a quick agenda for today, we're going to cover how to set up a client with a basic static HTML page and some Stripe.js installed. Then we'll install dependencies with pip. We'll implement a basic Flask server, adding some get routes and some post routes. And finally, we'll set up a super simple post route that you can use as your webhook handler. All right, let's jump in and take a look at what we might build today. So if you wanted to kind of just jump through time and go to the end and see what we're going to build, one tool that you can use, and you can also use this when we're going through office hours to install this base in this template, is by using the Stripe CLI. You can say Stripe samples list, and that gives you the list of all the different Stripe samples that you have access to. Today we're working with the developer office hours Stripe sample, which is actually a starter for all of the office hours that we're going to do moving forward, and it includes the boilerplate. It doesn't actually have the integration, but it includes the boilerplate. So you can install that by saying Stripe samples create and then passing in the name of the Stripe sample, so developer office hours in this case, and that'll allow you to pick which server you want to use. So in this case, we're talking about Python, and that creates a directory called developer office hours, and this is what we're going to implement today. So we have a client directory and a server directory, and in the client directory we have just a really simple index.html page. In the server directory we have a simple Flask server.py. So this is what we're gonna build today, is just this starter. So if you wanted to kind of jump to the end and just use that, there you go. Otherwise, follow along as we build this from scratch. So I'm just gonna remove that directory, and we're gonna start here with creating two directories, client and server, and then we're gonna first implement the client, just a really basic client. So client index.html. This is a blank file, and we're going to start off with just adding some basic HTML. So developer office hours might be the title. We'll drop in some CSS for structure and a couple of divs with a header tag here. At the bottom, we want to install Stripe.js. So the way that you do that is by adding a script tag that points at the Stripe.js library. So it looks just like this, and you want to make sure that your script tag does not have defer or async, and that it is pulling directly from js.stripe.com, so that you always have the most up-to-date version of the Stripe client, the Stripe.js client. Now for developer office hours, we'll often write the JavaScript related to a page directly inline, so in an inline script tag. For some of the Stripe samples, we'll include a JavaScript file that lives in the client directory that we refer to and pull in from the HTML client. So we'll have a script tag with a source that points to a JavaScript file in the project. For office hours, we're going to do it in line just so we have everything on screen. You can kind of see as we build. So most often we'll initialize an instance of Stripe. And in this case, I have hard-coded the publishable key, but we want to change the way we're doing that and instead fetch the publishable key from the server. So add a little to do to go fetch that publishable key from the server. So this is kind of the baseline HTML that we'll start with. And yeah, let's go head over, install some dependencies, and get started on the server. So I'm going to change directory into the server directory here. And then I'm going to use Python-3-m venv to create a virtual environment here. And I can say .venv/bin/activate to activate the virtual environment. And then I want to use pip to install dependencies. So I'm going to say pip install. And in this case, we need a handful of dependencies. We're going to use Flask. We're also going to use Stripe and Python.env to manage our environment variables. Again, we have that other episode about managing environment variables if you're curious. Okay. Great, so that's installing all of our dependencies. The next thing I'm going to do is copy in my .env file, which holds my Stripe keys. Okay, so now that we are installed, we can go implement a server.py. Okay, so again, this is going to start off as a blank file. And the very first thing I want to do is just load our environment variables and make an API request to Stripe just to make sure that things are working as expected. So let's import Stripe, and let's also import OS. That's going to be the package we use to access our environment variables. And then next we're going to install all the dependencies that come from Flask. So say from Flask, import Flask, capital, the class Flask. We also want to use a render template for sending back some HTML. We're also going to use JSONify for sending back JSON in a response. We want access to the request, and that, I think that should do it. Let's see. And then the next thing we want to do is import the tools to load our environment variable. So from .env, we want to import load.env and find.env. Okay, and so the way that we load those environment variables is we simply say load.env and we pass in find.env and execute that. Okay, so now we should be able to set our Stripe API key. So we're going to initialize the Stripe API key by saying stripe.api key equals os.get env, and then we pass in Stripe secret key. That installs, or that just sets the API key on Stripe so that we can make authenticated API requests. And then the next thing we want to do is just test this out. So let's see if our secret key was initialized correctly, and if we can receive some plans back, maybe from our account, that will tell us if we're using the right API key. So now we want to try something like maybe just print stripe.plan.list, and that should fetch our plans if we have any defined in our account. If we don't have any, we should still see some JSON with like an empty array for the plans that would have returned. So let's head over to our server directory and say Python server, and we get back some JSON with our plans. So that is working as expected. That's totally great. Cool. So let's go add a get route that should just return. So we're gonna start working with Flask now. We'll install a simple get route for the root route that we want to eventually return our HTML directly from the index.html page that we defined before. So let's start really simply and add a method here, and we'll call it index. And we want index to just return hello Stripe. It's kind of like the hello world here of Flask. And now the way that we tell this method that it is a route is by using this app.route decorator. So we say app.route, and we pass in some config options about the route. In this case, because it's a GET request and it's very default, we can just pass the string for the path that we want this method to return the result for. So we say app.route/, and that defines a route. So when a request comes into our server for the root route, it will execute this index function and return the string hello Stripe dev. So that's what we should see when we make a request. That should be the body of the response that we get. And then finally here at the bottom, we need to start up the app and actually run it. So we say app.run, and we pass in port 4242. And I'm remembering here that I didn't actually initialize an instance of app, so we need to do that also. So the way that we can initialize an instance of app is we say app equals Flask. So we call this like we are kind of like constructing an instance of Flask here, and we pass in __name, and that is the name of the current file, followed by static folder. And our static folder is a sibling of the server directory. So the directory we're in now is server, so we want to go up one and over to client. That's going to be our static folder. We also want to pass in static URL path, which is just the empty string. And then we also want to define the template folder so that we can use this render template method. So we say template folder is the same thing as the static folder, so // and that should initialize an instance of app for us. Okay, let's just go test and see if this is working as expected. So we want to go back to our server directory here and say Python server. That should start an instance of Flask. So now we're serving the Flask app called server, which was the name of the file here. And then we can use a command line tool called curl to make an HTTP request to our local running server. Curl is a command line HTTP client. It's very simple. So we can say curl localhost 4242, and this will make a GET request to our server. So let's just see if that worked. Okay. So the output of curl, we get back hello Stripe devs just as expected, and in our server logs we can see that there was a GET request made for /HTTP 1.1, and we responded with a 200 OK, and here is that response. Great. Let's push it one step further and see if we can get this to return some HTML. So rather than just returning this string hello Stripe devs, instead we want to also say render template. We want to tell it the name of the template, in this case index.html. Okay, so with that simple change, we'll restart the server and see if we can get that HTML back. And we did, so that looks great. And now we can actually click on this link and open up localhost 4242, and we see that's the HTML that we wrote. So that is working great. Next step, let's add another GET route to our server that will respond with the publishable key that is stored in the environment variables, and we can use that to make a request from our client to fetch the publishable key and set that. And this also demonstrates how you might make other GET requests to your server using JavaScript. All right, so we want to go back to the server. We want to add another GET route. This time we need to pass a new and different path name. So this is the path in the URL that the request is going to match. In this case, we want to say maybe something like public key, maybe public keys, and we'll make the method called public_keys. This is a pretty common convention. And what we want to do is return, in this case, we're returning JSON. So we want to say JSONify, and then we're going to pass in an object here that has key and the value of the key, which is in our environment variable. So we can say os.getEnv stripe publishable key. I think public key will work. Okay, great. So within a GET route, you can receive some arguments, usually as query string parameters, but you can also, maybe you might have like some arguments in the path. This is a very simple example where we're just returning something that was in the environment variables. You might also, access something in your database and return some JSON, or you might make a GET request to some API to fetch something and then return that as part of JSON. So this is just how you make a very simple GET route on your server. And in this case, we're just returning an environment variable. Let's go restart our server, test this out. So if we say curl localhost 4242/public keys, that'll make a GET route to our public keys endpoint, and we do indeed get back this key with publishable key, and that looks great. That looks just as we expect. So now let's go use this new route on our client. So if we go back to our index.html page, and rather than setting the publishable key this way, we want to instead make a call to our server public keys. Okay, so I'm using an HTTP client that is just vanilla JavaScript. It comes bundled with browsers. It's called Fetch, and like most HTTP clients, you can pass in a couple of configuration values and variables that allow you to configure the request, and then you can work with the response that you get back asynchronously. So in this case, because we're making a simple GET request, we just pass in the string value for the path that we want to make a request to from the client. So we say fetch public keys, and this returns a promise that resolves with this response object that itself has a JSON method that returns another promise that when resolved, resolves with this data object, which has the JSON for the response that we returned. So in this case, we want to set Stripe equal to, again, we're going to use that Stripe constructor function and pass in data.key to initialize a new instance of Stripe. And so this way we are storing our publishable key in an environment variable, fetching it on the client when we initialize. That way we can change between environments really easily. So we're just modifying environment variables on the server rather than passing in or like hard coding the publishable key on the client. So this is a little bit better practice, especially when using mobile clients. So if you're on iOS or Android, you definitely want to fetch your publishable keys from the server, just so that you can have a lot more control over if you need to roll a public key for some reason. So, all right, so now we have made this fetch. Let's go see if it works. So in the server, we need to restart the server here. And then we can go back to the browser and refresh this page. But I wanted to show you, you can access the Chrome developer tools by right-clicking and going to inspect. This is common across many browsers, so you will often have some sort of developer console, developer tools. The Chrome developer tools are very powerful. We have, when you first open it up, I usually use a Command Option I and the sort of the thumb smash I to open this. You see a bunch of tabs across the top. Today we're going to use sources and the network tab, but there's a lot of handy resources in the rest of these tabs that I would highly recommend becoming well accustomed with. So in the sources tab, if we find the index page that we just loaded, we can scroll down and you can use the JavaScript debugger by clicking on a line number in the gutter here and then refreshing the page, and that will break execution of your code at that point so that you can inspect values and variables. So here we can hover over Stripe and we see that it's currently undefined because we're about to execute this fetch function. Now you can use these buttons on the right to step through as you're executing. So once you're confident that your code is reaching a certain point, you can remove the breakpoint and click play. That resumes execution. Note that the fetch command here is making a network request to 127.0.0.1 or port 4242/public keys, and the data that we got back is indeed this data here, which we can hover over and kind of like inspect. We see that it did return a key. It is this PK test. It's our publishable key. So that is great. We can remove that breakpoint and click play. I also want to show the network tab. So if you go to the network tab here and we scroll down, we can see our this request for public keys. And we also see that it was a 200 OK. If you go to the preview, you can see the data that was returned. Pretty handy. If this was a post request, here at the bottom, you would see the payload for the post body that's being sent from the browser. I think we're looking good. That is working as expected. Let's head over to the server to add a new route that receives post requests. And then we'll add a button here on the client to just send a simple post request back to our browser, or I'm sorry, back to the server. Okay. So back to our server file, we want to add a new route that receives post requests. So it's very similar to a GET request. Here we say app.route, and then we pass in the path that we want to receive post request to. My route, we'll just call it something simple. And then in the case that you want to support post requests, you can pass this second argument to the app.route decorator here, where we say methods equals, and then a list of HTTP methods we want to support with this specific route. So we're going to say post so that we can receive post requests. So we'll call it my_route. And inside of this route, what we want to do is initially we'll just respond by echoing back the data that we received, and we'll kind of like nest it under a key so that we can kind of just get a sense for what's happening within this function. So we might say something like return JSONify our request, which is going to be request.json. And so this allows us to respond, and we'll just kind of like echo back the data that we received. Now, a couple of things to note. Inside of your post route, this is where you're typically going to be adding things to the database, making API calls, creating some resources. So you might be creating a payment or creating a customer or taking some action like creating a like or a comment. So this is the way that you can think of this is the post route is handling all of the data that might be collected up by a form or by a button click. it's receiving all of those checkboxes and radio buttons that you've selected, maybe files that you've uploaded, and it's receiving all of that data and making decisions about that and creating a resource. Okay, so a post route is the thing that handles when data is being sent to your server, a big chunk of data. Okay, so this, for now, let's also just print out like request.json test. So we'll test this out by passing in some test value. And maybe we can say like print this is test. Okay. All right, so now we have a new route. First, let's test it with curl. So we start our server and we can use curl with -x. So curl -X post. This allows us to pass in the HTTP method that we want to use. So we want to make a post request to localhost 4242 my route, and we want to pass in some data. So the data that we're going to pass in can be a JavaScript object. So we can use -d, and we want to, in single quotes, we'll pass our JavaScript object here. Test is 1, 2, 3, and we also want to tell the server that we're passing JSON. So we now can say -h content type is application JSON. Okay, we received an error. That's great. We failed here, and so in our server log we see the error. We see that when we tried to execute curl, we got back a 500 internal server error. All right, so let's go investigate. So if we read the error response here, error in app, exception on my route. All right, let's go to the very bottom. Name error, name request is not defined. So I spelled request wrong in our route. So let's go fix that. So this should be request. Okay, restart the server. And let's execute that same curl command. And all right, great. So this is test. We get the value 1, 2, 3. We passed in 1, 2, 3. Let's just, for fun, let's change this to 1, 2, 3, lots of zeros. So we get that value there in the server also. And the response is echoing back. This is our request, and it's kind of got the body there. So that's how we can pass in data with a post request from curl. Let's go see how we can do it from the client. So if we jump back over here and go back to our HTTP client, let's add a button here that just has ID BTN, and we'll say click me. Okay, so this is how we can add a post request to our client. So the first thing we want to do is grab reference to the button and then add a click handler so that when the button is clicked, we execute something. And then in the body of the click handler, we'll make a post request back to our new my route, and we'll pass back just some fake data. So we want to grab reference to the button, and we can do that by using this document.get element by ID, because we set the ID attribute on the HTML button that grabs reference to the button so we can interact with it with JavaScript. We want to add a click handler. So that looks like this. We call btn.add event listener. We pass in the name of the event we want to listen for, in this case click, and then we pass a callback function as the second argument to add event listener. And this callback function is what is invoked when that event happens. In this case, and the callback is past the actual event object, which has a method prevent default, which you can call so that the event that is executing doesn't bubble up. So in this case, if you have a button that's inside of a form and you don't prevent default, then when the button is clicked, that click event will bubble up to the form, and the form will execute a submit event, which oftentimes will cause a full page redirect. So most commonly, I'm making calls back to the server with Ajax and using JavaScript. So I almost always prevent default here. So I'm preventing default. I'm going to make now a call back to the server, making a post request again with fetch. So the first argument here is my route. That's the path that we want to make the request to. And the second argument is this option object that takes in method, which you can pass as the method that we want to make, or the type of HTTP request we're making here is a post. You can also pass in headers. Again, we want to set the content type to application JSON, so the server knows the data it's receiving is JSON. It knows to like sort of parse that out as JSON. And then we want to pass in the body, which is the string stringified JSON objects. In this case, we'll pass test again. Maybe we'll say, ABC123. We could also pass a customer like cus xxx. We might also pass a payment method. So maybe we tokenize the payment with Stripe JS or something. We want to pass that back to our server. We can say PM card Visa, which is one of our test cards. I also wanted to show that you can send nested data this way too. So you might have an address that itself has a line 1, Main Street or something, and this could be further nested, like type. I don't know. You might go even deeper with your nesting of the object that you're passing back to the server, and that's totally supported and totally works. This fetch again, the same way that it works with a GET request. When you make a POST request, it resolves with a promise that you can use this JSON method to return the JSON object that was returned in the response. In this case, we'll just console log that data again. All right, so now that we've implemented our client, let's go restart our server and go back to the browser and test this in the browser. So refresh the page. We now have a big, beautiful click me button. If I clear the network tabs, you can click on this no smoking sign to clear the network tab. And then if you click on the click me button, we see a network request was fired off. If we click on it, we see that it was a post request to my route. If we scroll to the bottom here, we can also see all the headers that were sent. If we scroll to the bottom, we see the payload, the request payload. So this was the post body that we sent. Looks all well formed. And then if we go to the preview tab, we see the response that came back from the server. So we see the response comes in with that request key that we added. It includes the address, customer, payment method, and this test value that we sent. And we did console log that here to the console. Again, if we wanted to, we could use the sources tab to set some breakpoints and see, okay, if I put a breakpoint right inside the callback function for click, if I click on the click button, then it breaks right there and I can sort of step through what's happening. So that's super handy. All right, I'm just going to play through. And I believe that looks good. We can go check our server log to see that we did receive this test value. We did ABC123. So everything is looking really good for our post. So that's how you can add a get route and a post route, and how you might interact with the values that came back. So again, in your post route handler, you might do something with the data that's coming back here. So request.json test or request.json customer to set the value of the customer or the payment method or what have you. All right, let's move on to the final step of our integration for today, which is adding a post route to handle a webhook event. So similar to this, it's going to be a route that receives methods of type post, and the path, we'll call it webhook. All right. So our webhook handler is going to be very simple today. We have a separate episode about working with webhooks. You can go check that out for more details. There's ways that you can verify the signature. You typically do not want to have authentication on the webhook. Instead, you use signature verification, where Stripe is passing a special header that you can match against a webhook secret. Again, go check out the webhook episode. We're not going to handle any of that today, but I wanted to just take a step back and talk about webhooks in general. So a webhook is a way for you to tell a third party where to send post requests when events happen. So in this case, when events happen on your Stripe account, for instance, an invoice is created or a customer is created or a payment is successful, you can take action. So I wanted to show you really quickly in the Stripe documentation, there is a massive list of event types here. So if you go to stripe.com/docs/API/events/types, there's a massive list of all the different event types that you might receive. So charge.dispute.funds withdrawn. One of the most common is invoice.created. This allows you to take action every time a subscription is renewing before it's finalized. You have invoice payment failed if you want to send some sort of email to the customer. There's a huge number of different webhook event types that you might receive. So payout.failed. And so today what we're going to do is just show a very simple example of how to implement the most basic webhook endpoint handler here. Another thing I want to mention is that users never see this webhook endpoint. They never interact with it. The only time that you're going to receive requests on the webhook endpoint is when Stripe is sending you some data about something that happened. This is all asynchronous. The customer never ever views this page. There's no redirect that happens inside of a webhook. In fact, if you redirect, it's considered sort of an error. You must respond with a 200 response to Stripe in your webhook handler. So the webhook is really just a way for you to automate different parts and application logic that depends on when events happen on Stripe. All right, so all that said, let's get started here. So we want to add in a new event. So we say event equals stripe.event.construct from, and we pass in the first argument is the JSON data that we received. So here we're going to say request.json. The second argument is our Stripe key. So os.getInv, again, Stripe secret key. And that will construct an event object. An event object has a type. So we can say maybe if the event.type is payment intent.created, then we want to print payment intent was created. Now you might take another action here. You might this is where you might fulfill some sort of order. The event type, so the event is a sort of generic object that has a type and it has a couple other attributes, but one of them is that it has this object, this data object, and that is going to be of the shape of a real object in the Stripe API. So in this case, for payment intent created, the type of the object we're getting back is a payment intent. So we can say, maybe here we can say payment intent equals event.data.object. Okay. We might also handle other event types. So if event.type is checkout.session.completed, in that case, the event type is going to be the event data object is going to be of type checkout session. So in this case, we can say maybe like the session is event.data.object. Okay. And then we can print, checkout session completed. Okay, in both of these cases, let's also log the ID of the object. So we can say payment intent.id. And for checkout session, we'll say checkout session.id. We can also print things like the status of the payment intent, payment intent.status. Okay, so you have access to the full object there. Which is very handy and allows you to automate a ton of things based on events that are firing in your account. So if you wanted to add support for a new event type, you just add a new if statement here that handles that type of event. Finally, we do want to return something valid. So we want to return here JSONify of just like maybe a message is success. And this is the response that's being sent back to Stripe, and you'll be able to see this in your Stripe dashboard. Okay, let's go test and see if this is working as expected. We're going to use the Stripe CLI to run some basic tests. So we want to restart our server, and then we can use Stripe listen forward to localhost 4242/webhook. So the Stripe listen command creates a direct connection from Stripe to your local machine and allows you to forward the requests that are coming from Stripe, the post requests that are coming from Stripe to this local webhook handler. This allows you to sort of avoid needing the use of a tunnel or publishing your code to some public URL while still testing your webhook endpoints. Very powerful. We go into much more detail in the Stripe CLI episode, so if you wanted to, you can check that out. The next thing I wanted to show you is that we can use the Stripe trigger command to cause an event type to happen. So payment intent created. So we say Stripe trigger, we pass in the event type that we want to fire, and under the hood, Stripe CLI is going to build up and make an API request that results in this type of event. So for payment intent created, it's a simple request. We fire off a request to create a payment intent, and this payment intent created event fires. And we see in our server log that payment intent was created. We see the ID here for the payment intent, and the status, there's no space there, but status is requires payment method. That's totally expected. And so that looks like it's working great. Let's also trigger checkout.session.completed. So for a checkout session to complete, there's a few other things that need to happen. So it needs to, create a payment page, create a payment method, create a customer. There's charges that are successful, payment intents that are successful. So we're seeing a whole bunch of different requests come through. We saw this checkout session completed event fire, and we actually got back a 500 HTTP status code from our server. So in this case, it looks like we have another error. So we have this call, or I guess we go straight to the bottom of the error message here. We say name error, name checkout _ session is not defined. I think I called it session. So let's go see if we can fix that. Yeah, so here, event.data.object, I stored it in a variable called session, and then I tried to access it with checkout _ session. So I don't need that first part of the name, so let's go restart the server and try this again. So checkout session completed. We can see all of the requests are being built up to result in a checkout session completed event. We see the payment intent was created, and the other HTTP requests are coming through, all with 200s. We are expecting this checkout session completed to fire, and there's the ID of the checkout session there at the end. So that is all looking good, and that is really the baseline for the boilerplate and the starter for working with Stripe Python and with Flask for office hours. So that completes the content for today's episode. Really thank you for listening and for sticking around. I hope that was super useful. We have thick skin, so if you have feedback for us, please let us know in the feedback form below. Remember that you're not alone when you're building your integration. We're here with you. We want to help you build your business. So if you have any questions at all as you're going through and building this out, feel free to jump on IRC with us. We're in the Freenode channel called Stripe. Otherwise, you can head up support.stripe.com with any other questions. Again, please let us know if you found this useful, and we'll see you in other office hours episodes. Cheers.